Screaming While Confessing Should. Chapter 2, The Notebook. First thing after putting the couch back in its place, I checked out the small library, hoping to find information about who lived here or at least where I was. Yesterday, when I looked into the library, the sun was high and the room vacant of light. It was dark and undefined. This morning, the library was still dark except the morning sun was now sneaking through a high window in the back of the room. It shined unobstructed all the way to the dusty wooden floor. The beam was so distinct it looked like a solid pillar of light. Small particles of radiant dust delicately levitated in its beam. I thought it surreal. Perhaps, in the past, an eternal being may have lived in this room. I sensed one doesn't stumble upon a scene like this. You are summoned, or drawn to it. I stood suspended at the doorway until compelled to enter. In the halo of light, I noticed the walls were old wooden bookshelves, reaching from the floor to the ceiling. The books on those shelves appeared as ghostly shadows, dark and obscure. Each shelf filled with eulogistic biographies, undeniable conspiracies, and precarious evidence of time and scope, represented in the form of manuscripts standing compact one next to the other. Nervously waiting to give up secrets, screaming while confessing should it be drawn, discovered, and exposed. I had to squint to see them. It smelled old like musty damp paper, ancient books. In my mind I conjured up the form of an enchanted being occupying several lifetimes, breathing this atmosphere, probing, and contemplating. There are particular places which draw you in while telling a whole story about itself, about you. The small library this morning appeared to be one of those magical places. I imagined myself being that ancient scholar living here seeking scientific interpretation of life while speaking in the language of incantations and riddles to an audience of one's self. I love libraries. Although, I am not a big reader, but more of a picture man myself. Once I entered, it pretended to be a whole other world. I couldn't help but sense something extraordinary would happen. Two wing-back chairs sat before a small desk towards the back, beyond the sunlight. Behind the desk was a high-back office chair. The desk itself was a mess of papers, books, and notebooks. I took a seat in the office chair. Once comfortable, I looked down and noticed a notebook on the desk with my name on it, in bold type. What? Why is my name on the notebook? It wasn't mine, or anything I had written. Obviously, someone put it there for me. So, after a short contest with paranoia, I opened to the first page which contained the title Sierra. Forgetting all the spellbound theater of enchantment earlier, I stopped there, got up and without a second thought walked outside onto the porch. Now, I was feeling more than a little apprehensive. I walked around the property hollering for anyone to come out. I never get too excited. Nothing surprises me. Although everything that has happened, and with my name being on the notebook, with the subtitle Sierra on the first page, I found it disturbing. Despite that, there was no immediate sense of fear, although I felt a sense of caution. Returning to the porch, I walked over to the rocking chair, and took a seat. I suspected it to be an elaborate joke by my friends. I yelled the names of the most notorious suspects. Come on you guys. This is not funny. Apparently, some miscreant who'd been within earshot of at least one of the many conversations I've had concerning Heaven and Sierra was having their way with me. I spent the next 15 minutes racking my brain trying to put it together. While trying to figure it all out, I became more anxious about my location than the notebook, but despite that I continued calling. No one responded. It made no sense that anyone would go through such trouble to manufacture this kind of joke for my benefit. I knew no one who had those kinds of resources to commit such an elaborate misdeed. Perhaps, my own Brutus wasn't so friendly and tried to make a point with their truck. I could live with a retired friend, sporting a new case of dementia trying to run me over, but the rest of this, light-hearted and friendly, crazy conspiracy would be impossible for anyone I know. I kept grabbing at straws hoping my friends, anyone, were playing a practical joke and messing with my head. I did not want to consider alternatives. One of which included an abduction by aliens. Yes, I went there. I proved to be a poor subject for experimental research. So, they wiped my memory and dumped me in the field to get rid of me as soon as possible. They should have at least taken me home. Such crazy analysis would have been a practical assertion except for the notebook. Dumb aliens, probably didn't know their way around the neighborhood. That is no way to get a second date. Of course, I'll be waiting by the phone, checking my messages, as I figuratively shook my head. Just then, I saw out of the corner of my eye a figure running behind the sheets hanging next to the cabin. It looked like an older man with long white hair and beard. I got up and hurried over to the area. There was no one there. I figured the person was too old to move that fast as to escape my detection. I walked all the way around the cabin. Yep, it was just my imagination. I went back in the cabin, and after walking through every room, I went back into the library to further investigate. I must have overworked my brain and had a hallucination. It made me feel more cautious. I opened the notebook and the title still read, Sierra. The subtitle on the next page read, To the Dreamer, Jeff Flake. Immediately, I became uncomfortable. How can this be? It was driving me crazy, and yet I was only 3 pages into the notebook. I stopped to massage my forehead. I became marginally dizzy, positively confused, as I mentally struggled with each page. I recalled every detail since the day before, from the point I ended up in the meadow until now. None of what had happened since can with any stretch of the imagination be possible. So, after fighting with myself, I came to the only sensible conclusion: the whole thing had to be supernatural, and I was ready to accept such a hypothesis. I sat back in the chair measuring my options on how to proceed. I wasn't even sure if I should, or wanted to. Clearly, the notebook was for me. So after a catch-my-breath pause, I determined to read it and disengage the dramatics. The body of the notebook read: Jeff, this notebook has information to help you complete your adventure. What adventure? I said out loud. We have suspended your duties as a watcher. In case you forgot what a watcher is, please note, it's an office like a governor, a senator, or a janitor. Watchers are officials who clean up messes in Sierra and are often tasked with assessing problems and advising others how to resolve those problems. Each watcher performs their duties by observing the daily life of ordinary people, communities, cities, local, and national governments. Then, they advise persons, agencies, or principalities on workable courses of action, based on pertinent information and circumstances. They are not constrained by any of the individuals or agencies mentioned. Each reports directly to officials in Jerusalem. I understood all that. I paused again. It appears someone had too much interest in my daydreams. I never spoke in such detail with anyone about watchers for fear friends or family might accuse me of having mental deficiencies. I knew what a watcher was. It's the profession I held in my daydreams of Sierra, but I had never revealed, explained, or shared that much information with anyone. Sierra was where I planned to live during the millennium. It's a region in space which included 5 galaxies and 133 inhabitable planets. While most people remained on Earth during the millennium, 42 immortals, redeemed human beings, along with adoptive parents, and 84 million orphan children would leave the Earth and live abroad. That is the basis of my story. As I continued reading, how odd, as the next sentence read, Jeff, don't get distracted by the sunbeam. I knew my dramatic entrance would come back to haunt me. Unintentionally, I turned my attention to the hypnotic dust floating mystically downward and upward in the column of sunlight invading through the single window behind me. Someone knows me well. I became captivated as it seemed alive with movement. Then, I had the same surreal sensation I often got when dreaming of heaven, imagining myself there. Despite my bewildered condition, I realized something was not right. No one goes to heaven this way when they die or raptured. All the first steps were absent. There was no gathering in the clouds. Did I miss the marriage supper of the Lamb? What else did I miss? I struggled again with whether I was deceased or alive. Oddly, it was still a needling and nagging concern. Was I dead? Was I somewhere on the earth? I went someplace. I didn't know where. I lost my confidence in everything at that moment. I only wished someone was around to resolve my questions. I wondered if I were fabricating the whole thing in my mind. Maybe I am in bed, in a coma, dreaming. I had an abysmal twisting feeling in my stomach. This adventure proved more than just imagination, and I was struggling with it. Again, I thought of the supernatural. I had to stop reading. I moved the chair back and sat there for an hour recounting my condition, all the while staring at the dust, carefully deciding whether to continue. Feeling uncomfortable, I retrieved another glass of orange juice and returned to the front porch where I took a seat in the rocking chair. I sat there until my attention turned back to my present environment. Even in my altered condition, I loved viewing the yard, the forest and the lake. I noticed hundreds of bright colorful hummingbirds feeding from a bush in the front yard. A bright blue one flew towards the cabin and under it. The birds were building their nests under the porch. I thought I would have a look. Lattice skirted the bottom of the cabin. As I got closer to see if I could find a nest, I realized the cabin appeared to be sitting on that lattice as its foundation. Then, I noticed it did not touch the ground. The cabin was floating off the ground. Grass, the land under it was as normal as the rest of the yard, and green. The cabin was placed in this spot recently. Otherwise, the plants and grass should have been dead and brown from lack of sunlight. You know what? I didn't even flinch, or consider the implications. Of course it's floating off the ground. Of course I was flung into the middle of a dream after getting into an accident. Of course I am reading a book exposing said dream. I wanted it to be shocking, but it was not. So, zombie-like, I moseyed back up to the porch, sat down and devoured the view. A couple hours later, after observing and meditating on the sound of the squeaking wood rocking chair against the wood porch, I returned to the library, and opened the notebook to read again. You must tell this story, Jeff. By the beginning of the tribulation, the world spiraled into a miserable, chaotic state. All governments were no longer strong, moral, or rich enough to pull it back together. America was in shambles, having overextended itself through corrupt politicians and 3 short failed dictatorships. The America you knew, the light of the world, had completely digressed into a feudal society. Economic times were so pathetic many families were living on the street, wandering from place to place, desperately trying to find something to eat. Unfortunately, suicide became a leading cause of death throughout the world, accompanied by starvation. Many took their own lives before dying slowly from starvation. It was heart-wrenching to see whole families take their own lives. Even more disturbing was no one cared as the world became immersed in a state of profound indifference towards one another. For an unexplained reason, something compelled me to stand. As soon as I stood, I was no longer in the library, but in a house. In front of me was a young man with a contorted look on his face, who I perceived to be a cop or detective. Even though he was wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, he had an official air around him. He stood 6 feet tall, and was in good shape, with dark short neatly cut hair. He was speaking to an officer, who was wearing a brown policeman's uniform, in a serious tone. His voice sounded familiar, but I could not place him. He looked at me and said, "Hi, Jeff. How are you?" I tried to explain how I got there when he cut me off and said, "We are not here for personal reasons." Another officer in a brown uniform came walking by and said, "Hello, Jack." "Good morning," he replied. Okay, his name was Jack. Rude Jack, I speculated. We were standing in a long dim hallway. I struggled with a slight dizziness from dropping into the hallway. Again, I tried to explain when he startled me with a serious stare, a look directing me to pay attention. I looked away to observe the scene. A beautifully designed carpet ran the full length of the hall where we were standing. Paintings were hanging from one end to the other on both sides. Several intricately carved wooden doors lined each side. It unquestionably was the home of a wealthy person. Jack gave details. "We are in South Carolina. This home used to be a gorgeous plantation, full of light, blooming gardens, lush fields, and a family's paradise." We walked to the end of the hall into a child's bedroom. Inside was a small child, dead, lying on her bed. She was carefully dressed in her pajamas and placed as if she were quietly, comfortably sleeping. The heartbroken sun was shining through the windows of her room, lighting several stuffed animals placed next to her. She lay there so naturally in the middle of them. The child was barely 6 years old. I gasped, and shouted, "What is going on?" Jack ignored me and continued talking. 7 children lay about this house, each murdered by their parents. We walked back down the hall past other bedrooms, and each room was just as disturbing. Children posed in different gentle positions upon their beds, including twins and a toddler in his crib carefully dressed up, as if for Sunday school, I assumed. These parents loved their children. So, what was it that made life so horrible as to cause them to commit such a shocking massacre? We walked downstairs to the dining room. The parents were behind their dining room table, each bent over on the floor as if praying. Both had taken their own lives. The woman looked thin and frail. The husband had laid his bony arm around her, over her back. An empty bottle of cyanide lay on the floor before them. Their heads were turned and contorted to the side, enough to see the anguish on their faces, their tear-stained faces, broken tear-stained faces. Jack continued, "These people were starving to death. Too bad the parents didn't call on God before it was too late, which was the real tragedy here. What a catastrophe. What an example of man's vile condition during the 7 years of tribulation. No other way to explain it, Jeff." Unfortunately, this scene played out all over the world. Then, Jack turned and said, "Listen, Jeff, I was standing in the kingdom of God when everything became silent for 1/2 hour. For the first 5 minutes it was dead silent. Then, in the quietness, I heard the distant sound, a broken sound of someone weeping. It was so heartfelt and gentle, I had to strain to hear it. I could not tell if it were a man, a woman or a child. Perhaps, it was all of them. It led me to my knees with despair. I wept within my soul as if trying to console my own whispers about brokenness. The mourning came from every direction. I have never heard such pleading, and couldn't imagine anyone felt that kind of pain. I looked around me, and those beside me were also on their knees. No one daring to make a noise as the psalm of tears filled all of heaven. At the end of the half hour, everyone stood to their feet and worshipped God. A man came up staring at me. I asked him who was weeping. He said, "God was weeping. Christ was weeping, and the Holy Spirit was weeping, for the indifference conceived in the hearts of men." Jack continued, "Jeff, it was not hate, it was not love. It was that profound indifference that had invaded the world that broke God's heart." After staring at me for a moment, Jack turned back around and walked out the front door. I followed him. "Yes, Jack, I understand what you just said," I responded. Once we passed through the door, we were on a dark street. It looked like a middle-class neighborhood. It was eerily quiet and all the houses were dark, perhaps vacant. I saw only 2 dim street lights on up ahead, of a dozen along the street. Fires were burning 2 blocks over as you could see the flickering light in the background against the black sky. A pack of dogs came running out of the shadows and past us, each one thin, mangy, and starving. Fortunately, the creatures ignored us. Jack, without missing a beat, kept speaking as the animals ran down the street. It was unsafe to be out at night as dogs and other feral pets roamed the streets, assaulting or killing anything that moved. Many beloved pets were left to fend for themselves. Most were starving along with their owners. I became apprehensive. We walked 2 blocks and turned right at the corner to where we could see the fires. I observed a barbed wire fence between us and several bonfires ablaze on the other side. As we got closer, I felt nauseous when I saw the bodies stacked against the fence. Family members were standing right outside the fence sobbing over the dead bodies, frail and holding on to one another. A man fell to his knees while praying before a lifeless body of a young woman. I assumed the woman to be his wife. People in uniform, wearing smoke-stained masks, were carrying the lifeless bodies, tossing them onto the fires. As they did, I heard others who stood outside the fence calling out their names, screaming tormented hearts. Jack continued, people were dying everywhere. These fires burned in every neighborhood and filled the air with a putrid smell of burning and rotting flesh. Men tried to curtail diseases brought on by the decomposing bodies, but millions got sick and died from those diseases. Conditions were similar in every city and country throughout the world. For many their situation was much worse. How can anything be worse than watching your loved one being tossed onto a bonfire? We walked up to a gate in the fence. Jack opened it and we entered. Once through, we were standing in an old broken-down cement building or warehouse. Inside sat a man and woman speaking Japanese. The only light was a candle on a small table between them, casting their eerie shadows against the walls of the room. I could barely make out what they were doing through the flickering light and the maze of shadows. Apparently, the couple were praying to their god and preparing to eat. As my eyes adapted to the light, I saw what they were eating. They were praying for and eating the human arm of a man, or a woman, perhaps a child. I could now see small boiled fingers where the flesh was cooked away. With my eyes readjusted to the dusky light, I saw how grossly thin they were. Both began crying, then sobbing, and picking at the flesh. Jack looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, regularly, cannibalism followed the mealtime prayer. Regularly, cannibalism followed the mealtime prayer. Regularly, cannibalism